Imagine getting a call every parent dreads. Your child has been attacked, and no one stepped in to help. Whitney Davis's world was turned upside down the day she got that call about her 12-year-old son, Kionni. But what she discovered next, hidden away in school bus footage, would leave her shocked and desperate for answers. What really happened on that bus? And why didn't anyone stop it? The truth was far worse than she ever expected. Stick around to find out how this story unfolds and the surprising fight for justice that followed. But first, let's see how many likes we can gather to show support for this brave young boy. Let's come together and lift him up. Whitney Davis had always been fiercely protective of her 12-year-old son, Kionni. As any mother would, she made sure to teach him the values of kindness, respect, and the importance of standing up for himself. But no lesson or precaution could have prepared either of them for what happened on that bus ride home one afternoon in September. The moment she got the call from Kammerer Middle School, her world was turned upside down. As a parent, Whitney had feared the possibility of her son being bullied. But nothing had prepared her for this level of violence, negligence, and trauma. The call had been brief, but the words echoed in her ears long after it ended. "Your son was attacked on the school bus." Her heart sank as the voice on the other end of the line explained what had happened. She felt frozen, trapped in a nightmare as she rushed to her car and sped toward the school. Her hands gripped the steering wheel, her mind racing with questions. How had this happened? Where were the adults who were supposed to be protecting him? Why hadn't anyone stopped it? She arrived at the school only to find Kionni waiting for her in the office, visibly shaken. He had a bruise forming on his jaw. His clothes were rumpled and his eyes were red from crying. Seeing her son like that, so small, vulnerable, and scared, made Whitney's heart break into 1,000 pieces. She rushed to his side and pulled him into her arms, holding him tightly as if she could shield him from the cruelty of the world just by hugging him. "Kionni, baby, what happened?" she whispered, stroking his hair as he trembled in her arms. He didn't answer right away. It was as if he didn't have the words, or maybe he didn't want to relive the horror of what had happened. Eventually he muttered, "They were picking on me, Mom. They hit me and everyone just watched." Tears welled up in Whitney's eyes as Kionni explained, in halting sentences, how it had all unfolded. It had started in school earlier that day, with a group of boys taunting him, calling him names, and mocking him for being different. Kionni had tried to ignore them, hoping the insults would stop, but they hadn't. By the time they all boarded the bus, the taunts had escalated into a physical attack. "They just started hitting me," Kionni whispered, staring at the floor. "They wouldn't stop. They kept hitting me, and no one did anything." As Whitney listened to her son's account, her initial sadness turned to anger. The thought of her sweet, gentle boy being targeted by bullies enraged her. But even worse was the knowledge that adults, the bus driver, the school staff, had done nothing to protect him. How could this have been allowed to happen? And why hadn't the school called her sooner? The next morning, Whitney was on the phone with the school district demanding answers. She needed to know what had gone wrong and why no one had intervened to stop the assault on her son. The school had assured her that they were investigating. But Whitney wasn't satisfied with vague reassurances. She wanted action. She wanted accountability. She met with the administrators of Kammerer Middle School that afternoon. Sitting in a small conference room with the principal, the school resource officer, and the head of transportation for the district, Whitney's frustration only grew. The school officials were apologetic, but their words felt hollow, like they were more interested in covering their tracks than in truly addressing the situation.
I met with head of security and a Mr. Holbrook, I believe, is another official from Kammerer.
"We're conducting a full investigation," the principal had said, folding his hands on the table. "There are cameras on the bus that record both audio and video, and we will be reviewing that footage to understand exactly what happened." Whitney leaned forward in her chair, her eyes burning with determination. "I want to see that footage. When can I see it?" There was a pause as the principal exchanged a glance with the resource officer. "We're working on retrieving the video," he said, his tone cautious. "It may take a few days, but we will notify you as soon as it's available." "A few days!" The words hit Whitney like a punch to the gut. Her son had been attacked, and they were telling her to wait? She could feel the anger bubbling up inside her, but she forced herself to remain calm. She wasn't going to let them see how upset she was. Not yet.
They said that they have not been able to get the video yet, that I would have it in the next few days.
I don't understand, Whitney said, her voice tight. You have cameras on the bus, and you're telling me it's going to take days to get the footage? This happened on school property. You should have had that video ready immediately. We understand your frustration, Mrs. Davis, the resource officer chimed in. But there are procedures we have to follow. I assure you, we're doing everything we can to resolve this as quickly as possible. Whitney wasn't convinced. She had heard enough bureaucratic excuses to know when she was being stonewalled, but she also knew that she couldn't afford to lose her temper. Not yet. She needed to stay focused on getting justice for Kionni. Over the next few days, Whitney tried to be patient, but her frustration only grew as the school's promises of swift action seemed to evaporate. She called the district office every day, demanding updates, but all she got in return were vague assurances that they were still working on it. It was clear to her that they were dragging their feet, hoping that the situation would blow over and that she would eventually give up. But Whitney had no intention of giving up. Every day that passed without answers only fueled her determination to hold the school accountable. She knew that what had happened to Kionni wasn't an isolated incident. If the school had allowed this kind of violence to go unchecked, then how many other students had suffered in silence? She began researching the school's policies on bullying and student safety, reading through the student handbook and comparing it to what had happened to Kionni. It didn't take long for her to find glaring discrepancies.
The student policy is outlined in here on how they handle bullying. They haven't done it.
The school had strict policies in place to prevent bullying, but they clearly hadn't been followed. The bus driver was supposed to intervene in situations like this, but she had done nothing. The students who had attacked Kionni should have faced immediate consequences, but they hadn't.
She never even told the kids to sit down. They have a policy that she's supposed to follow, and she didn't.
Whitney took her concerns to the school board, speaking at a public meeting and demanding that the district take action. She wasn't just fighting for Kionni anymore, she was fighting for all the students who had been failed by a system that was supposed to protect them. These children are entrusted to your care every day, Whitney said, her voice shaking with emotion as she addressed the board. You have a responsibility to keep them safe. My son was beaten on your bus while your driver did nothing. And now you're telling me to wait for answers? That's unacceptable. The room was silent as Whitney finished speaking, the weight of her words hanging in the air. The board members exchanged uncomfortable glances, clearly caught off guard by her passionate plea. We take all reports of bullying and violence very seriously, one of the board members finally said, and we will thoroughly investigate this matter. But Whitney wasn't satisfied with promises of an investigation. She had heard it all before, and she knew that words alone wouldn't bring about real change. She needed to take action, and that's when she decided to hire an attorney. With her attorney by her side, Whitney filed a formal complaint against the school district, citing their failure to protect Kionni and their negligence in handling the situation. The legal process was slow and grueling, but Whitney was prepared to fight as long as it took to get justice for her son. In the meantime, Kionni was struggling to cope with the emotional aftermath of the attack. He had always been a bright, cheerful boy, but now he seemed distant, withdrawn. He barely spoke at home, and when he did, it was usually to express his fear about going back to school. I don't want to go, Mom, he said one morning, his voice trembling as he sat on the edge of his bed. What if they do it again? Whitney's heart ached for her son. She knew that no amount of reassurance could take away the fear he felt. The scars left by the attack weren't just physical, they were emotional, and they ran deep. We're going to get through this, baby, Whitney said softly, sitting down next to him and wrapping her arm around his shoulders. I'm not going to let anything like that happen to you again. I promise. But even as she said the words, Whitney knew that it would take more than promises to heal the wounds that had been inflicted on her son. After what felt like an eternity of waiting, Whitney finally received a call from the school district. The video footage from the bus had been retrieved, and she was invited to come to the district office to review it. She felt a mixture of relief and dread as she prepared to watch the footage, knowing that it would likely confirm her worst fears. When she arrived at the district office, she was led to a small conference room where a laptop was set up to play the video. The principal and the resource officer from Camera Middle School were there, along with the head of transportation. Whitney sat down at the table, her hands clenched in her lap as the video began to play. The footage was grainy, but it was clear enough to see what had happened. The bus had just pulled away from the school when the verbal taunts started. The boys who had targeted Kionni could be seen sitting in the back of the bus, leaning over the seats and shouting insults at him. Kionni tried to ignore them, his body tense as he stared straight ahead. Then, without warning, one of the boys stood up and lunged at Kionni, punching him in the face. Kionni tried to defend himself, but he was outnumbered. The other boys joined in, hitting him and kicking him as he curled up in his seat, trying to protect himself. The bus driver was visible in the video, sitting at the front of the bus, completely oblivious to what was happening. She didn't turn around, didn't say anything, didn't intervene in any way. She just kept driving as if nothing was wrong. Whitney's hands shook as she watched the attack unfold on the screen. Her heart pounded in her chest, and she felt sick to her stomach. How could this have been allowed to happen? How could the adults who were supposed to protect her son have failed him so completely? When the video ended, Whitney sat in stunned silence for a moment, her mind reeling. She wanted to scream, to demand answers, to make someone pay for what had happened to her son. But she knew that losing her temper wouldn't help. She had to stay focused, had to keep fighting for Kionni. "This is unacceptable," Whitney said, her voice shaking with anger. "My son was attacked on your bus, and your driver did nothing to stop it. What are you going to do about it?" The principal and the resource officer exchanged nervous glances. "We're taking this matter very seriously," the resource officer said. "The students involved in the attack will face disciplinary action, and we're reviewing our policies to ensure that this doesn't happen again." But Whitney wasn't satisfied with vague promises of disciplinary action. She wanted real change. She wanted to make sure that no other child would have to go through what Kionni had endured. As the weeks went by, Whitney's fight for justice continued. She filed charges against the students who had attacked Kionni, and she worked with her attorney to build a case against the school district. She also became an advocate for student safety, speaking out at school board meetings and in the media, demanding that the district take action to protect its students. Through it all, Whitney remained a pillar of strength for Kionni, helping him heal from the trauma he had experienced. It wasn't easy. There were days when Kionni seemed lost in his own pain, days when he couldn't bring himself to talk about what had happened. But Whitney never gave up on him. She knew that healing would take time, but she also knew that Kionni was strong and that with the right support, he would get through this. In the end, Whitney's efforts paid off. The students who had attacked Kionni were held accountable for their actions, and the school district was forced to make changes to its policies. New safety protocols were implemented on school buses, and bus drivers received additional training on how to handle bullying and violent incidents. The district also promised to take a tougher stance on student misconduct, ensuring that incidents like the one involving Kionni would never be allowed to happen again. But for Whitney, the fight wasn't over. She continued to advocate for student safety, working with other parents and community leaders to raise awareness about the issue. She knew that there were many more battles to be fought, and she was determined to keep fighting for as long as it took to make a difference. As for Kionni, the road to healing was long and difficult. But with his mother by his side, he slowly began to rebuild his confidence and sense of security. He still had bad days, days when the memory of the attack would come rushing back, filling him with fear and anxiety. But with Whitney's love and support, Kionni knew that he wasn't alone in his journey. In the end, Whitney's relentless pursuit of justice brought about real change, not just for Kionni but for all the students in the district. Her fight had shined a light on an issue that had been too often overlooked, and her courage and determination had made a lasting impact on the community. And while the scars from the attack would never fully fade, Whitney knew that she had done everything in her power to protect her son and ensure that he and others like him would never have to suffer in silence again. Whitney and Kionni walked quietly to their car after the school board meeting. The applause still echoed in Whitney's mind, but it hadn't brought the kind of closure she had hoped for. Yes, the school board had made changes. Yes, the bullying policies were being reformed. But deep down, Whitney knew that the victory wasn't about changing the system. It was about healing her son, and that part of the journey still felt as daunting as ever. As they reached the car, Whitney glanced at Kionni. His face was calm, expressionless, as if he were miles away. She opened the car door for him, but before he climbed in, she touched his shoulder gently. "You okay?" she asked, though the answer was always the same. Kionni nodded, but it was the automatic response she had come to expect. It wasn't that he didn't want to talk, he just didn't have the words. Whitney had hoped that after everything they had been through, after standing in front of all those people and hearing how proud they were of her, maybe it would give him some comfort. But instead, it seemed like he had withdrawn even further. As they drove home, the silence between them stretched on, thick and unspoken. The radio played softly in the background, but Whitney barely noticed. Her thoughts drifted back to the therapy sessions. They had been going for months now, and though the therapist was good, progress had been slow. Kionni had been reluctant at first. He hated the idea of talking to a stranger about his feelings. But Whitney had insisted, knowing that the emotional toll of the attack would take much longer to heal than any bruise or cut. Dr. Reynolds, the therapist, had warned Whitney from the beginning that this would be a process. Trauma affects everyone differently, he had said, especially kids. They don't always know how to articulate what they're feeling. It's going to take time and patience. Time and patience. Whitney felt like she had nothing but time, and yet, no matter how hard she tried, patience often eluded her. There were days when she wanted to shake Kionni out of his silence, to demand that he tell her what was going on inside his head. But she knew that wouldn't help him. He needed to come to terms with this in his own way, in his own time. All she could do was be there for him as she had always been. When they got home, Kionni went straight upstairs as he often did these days. He spent most of his time in his room either doing homework or playing video games. Whitney wished he would spend more time with his sister or even hang out with friends, but that seemed to be too much for him right now. The social isolation had been one of the hardest things for him to overcome. He didn't trust the other kids anymore, even the ones who hadn't been involved in the attack. The betrayal of that day had left a scar deeper than anyone could see. Whitney sighed and sank into the couch, closing her eyes for a moment. She had become accustomed to this new normal. The quiet evenings, the tension in the house, the feeling of walking on eggshells. But she missed her son. She missed the way he used to joke around, the way he would race his sister to the dinner table, the way he would talk to her about school and friends, and all the things that mattered to him. Now, it was as if a wall had gone up, and she didn't know how to bring it down. She knew she had to be patient. She reminded herself of that every day. But there were moments when the frustration bubbled up, when she just wanted to scream at the universe for what it had done to her family. The next day was a Saturday, and Whitney had arranged for a small get-together with some of her friends and their kids. She had hesitated at first, knowing that Kionni wasn't in the mood for socializing. But she also knew that he couldn't hide from the world forever. He needed to be around people to see that not everyone was out to hurt him. "Kionni," she called up the stairs, "we're having some friends over today. You should come downstairs and hang out for a bit." There was a long pause before he answered, "I don't feel like it." Whitney closed her eyes and took a deep breath. "I know you don't, baby, but it'll be good for you. You can just hang out for a little while, and if you're not feeling it, you can go back upstairs." "I'm fine," he called back. "I don't want to." Whitney stood at the bottom of the stairs, frustration gnawing at her. She knew pushing him too hard would only make things worse, but she also knew that isolation wasn't the answer. She walked up a few steps, her voice softening. "Kionni, I know things have been really hard, and I'm not asking you to pretend like everything's okay, but I don't want you to shut yourself off from everyone. You don't have to talk to anyone if you don't want to. Just come downstairs and be with us for a bit. Please?" There was a long silence, and Whitney thought for sure he was going to refuse again. But then she heard his door creak open. A moment later, Kionni appeared at the top of the stairs, looking hesitant, but at least he was coming down. Whitney smiled at him, trying not to make a big deal out of it. "Thanks, honey. Just give it a try, okay?" He nodded and followed her down to the living room. A few of her friends had already arrived, their kids playing in the backyard. Whitney watched as Kionni sat down on the couch, pulling out his phone as if to create a barrier between himself and the rest of the world. Her friend Melissa came over, giving her a sympathetic smile. "How's he doing?" she asked in a low voice. Whitney shook her head slightly. "He's getting there. It's slow." Melissa nodded. I can't even imagine what you've been going through. If you ever need anything, you know I'm here, right?" "Thanks," Whitney said, feeling the weight of her friend's support. "I appreciate it." As the day went on, Whitney kept a close eye on Kionni. He didn't say much, but he didn't retreat back to his room either. He even ventured outside for a few minutes to watch the other kids play, though he kept his distance. It wasn't much, but it was progress. That evening, after everyone had gone home, Whitney found herself sitting on the back porch, staring out at the quiet yard. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the grass. She could hear the faint sound of Kionni's video game from the living room, but for the most part, the house was still. She thought about everything they had been through, everything that still lay ahead. The legal battles, the therapy, the slow process of rebuilding their lives. It was exhausting, and there were days when she didn't know how much longer she could keep going. But then she thought about Kionni, about the look in his eyes when he had come downstairs that afternoon, about the small steps he had taken toward healing. She knew they weren't out of the woods yet. There would be more hard days, more setbacks. But for the first time in a long time, Whitney allowed herself to feel hope. Weeks later, Whitney and Kionni sat in Dr. Reynolds' office for another therapy session. Kionni had started opening up more in recent sessions, talking about his feelings in a way that surprised Whitney. He still had his walls up, but they were beginning to crack. "So, how are you feeling about school now?" Dr. Reynolds asked, his voice calm and steady. Kionni shrugged. "It's better, I guess." "Better how?" Dr. Reynolds prompted. Kionni hesitated for a moment, then glanced at his mother before speaking. "People don't really talk about what happened anymore. I mean, some of them do, but it's not like before." Whitney's heart ached for him. She knew how much he hated being the center of attention, especially after the attack, but it was a good sign that things were starting to settle down. "And how about your friends?" Dr. Reynolds asked. "Have you been spending time with them?" "Yeah," Kionni said, though his tone was still guarded. "A little bit." Whitney had noticed the change too. He had started texting his friends again, even hanging out with them after school once or twice. It wasn't the same as before, but it was something. "I'm proud of you, Kionni," Dr. Reynolds said with a small smile. "You've made a lot of progress." Kionni didn't respond, but Whitney could see the faintest hint of a smile on his face. It was the first time she had seen him smile in what felt like forever. As they left the office and walked to the car, Whitney put her arm around Kionni's shoulders. "You're doing so well, baby," she said softly. "I know it's hard, but you're getting stronger every day." Kionni didn't say anything, but he leaned into her, just for a moment. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. For the first time in months, Whitney felt like they were going to be okay. The road ahead was still long, but they were walking it together, and that was all that mattered.